The attic smelled of old cedar and insulation, a scent that clung to my clothes no matter how often I shook them out. The ceiling sloped so low on one side that I had to stoop to reach my narrow bed, its frame pressed against the wall under a single bulb dangling from a cord. A small window looked out over the street, but most days the glass was too clouded to see much beyond the blurred shapes of passing cars. I kept my suitcases stacked neatly in the corner, lids zipped tight so the dust wouldn't settle inside. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me that this space wasn't meant for living. It was for boxes, forgotten holiday decorations, and anything else people wanted out of sight. After 34 years of marriage, this was where I'd landed out of sight. What made it harder to swallow was knowing that, 2 weeks ago, Calvin had signed the papers on a brand new apartment for his mother-in-law. Granite countertops, a balcony overlooking the river, stainless steel appliances. He'd shown me the listing once, beaming like he'd done something noble. I'd smiled politely, though inside I was still trying to understand why her comfort warranted a mortgage while mine could be handled with a hand-me-down mattress in an unheated attic. One afternoon, while dust motes drifted in the pale winter light, I turned on the small TV Calvin had let me keep up here. A smiling news anchor was talking about the state lottery. Record-breaking jackpot, the crawl read, estimated at over $3 million. The numbers meant nothing to me in that moment. Winning was for other people, the kind whose luck hadn't run dry years ago. That evening, I made my way down the narrow staircase, careful not to scuff the walls. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the kitchen. Calvin and Tessa were already seated, their conversation hushed until I walked in. I took the empty chair at the end of the table, close enough to hear them, but far enough to feel the chill of being an afterthought. Tessa passed me a plate with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Calvin asked about my day without looking up from his phone. I answered politely, kept my head down, and ate in silence, thinking of the attic above and the warmth I'd never quite find there. The smell of coffee drifted up the attic stairs before the sun had fully risen. I made my way down, careful not to wake the house with the groan of the steps. Calvin was already in the kitchen, hair damp from the shower, tie hanging loose around his neck. Tessa stood at the counter blending her morning smoothie, the low hum filling the space between us. I reached for the toaster, sliding in 2 slices of bread. When Calvin spoke without looking at me, "You know, Mom, if you wanted comfort, you should have stayed married to Dad." The words landed like a slap. I kept my hand steady as I pressed the toaster lever, focusing on the click it made. The faint smell of warming bread. Years of managing my expressions served me well. I didn't flinch, didn't let the tremor in my chest show. I had given up graduate school so Calvin could be born without debt hanging over us, worked part-time jobs when he was little, then full-time once he started school, funneling every paycheck into bills, tuition, his sports equipment, his braces. I'd nursed him through the flu, stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, planned birthday parties he'd barely remember. 34 years of marriage and motherhood had been one long act of service. And now my reward was a mattress in the attic, and the suggestion that my own choices had brought me here. I buttered my toast with slow precision, keeping my eyes on the plate. "You're probably right," I said evenly, sliding into a chair. It was the only response I trusted myself to give. Calvin sipped his coffee, satisfied, already moving on to the day's schedule. Tessa glanced at me briefly, then back to her blender. Neither of them noticed how quietly I pushed my plate away after 2 bites. Upstairs, the attic air felt heavier than usual. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the window's blurred glass, and knew with perfect clarity that I couldn't stay here not one more week, not one more day longer than necessary. Tomorrow, I would start figuring out where to go that night. After Calvin and Tessa had gone to bed, I sat cross-legged on the attic floor with my laptop balanced on my knees. The glow from the screen made the dust motes look like tiny fireflies drifting through stale air. My checking account balance blinked back at me, $923.16. That was all I had in my own name. The divorce settlement was still tied up in arguments between lawyers, each side clawing over property lines and retirement accounts. Joint accounts were frozen, and every dollar I touched now had to be accounted for in court. What I had in that checking account was what I'd managed to set aside quietly over the years, unremarkable amounts from grocery savings, birthday cash, and the odd refund check through the floorboards. I caught Calvin's voice. I couldn't make out every word, but the strain in his tone was new. Yes, I understand the numbers don't look good. No, I'll find a way to cover it. A pause. No, Tessa doesn't know. The rhythm of his pacing came through the boards. Slow, deliberate. Like a man rehearsing his next move, I closed the laptop. Lying back on the bed, if his finances were faltering, mine were in ruins. The attic walls felt closer than ever, the air thin. I'd been telling myself I could endure this a little longer. But the truth was simpler. I had no reason to. Before dawn, I moved quietly through the attic, folding clothes into my worn duffel and slipping my laptop into its case. The zipper's rasp sounded far too loud in the stillness. My second bag, just shoes and a few books, was light enough to carry without effort. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused to listen. The house was silent. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I eased the front door open, the cool air rushing in like a promise. By the time the first streaks of morning light touched the street, I was walking toward the bus station, my bags in hand and no plan beyond getting as far from that attic as I could. The bus station cafe smelled faintly of burnt toast and strong coffee. I slid into a corner booth, my bags tucked close, and counted the bills in my wallet. $10 was all I felt comfortable spending that day, enough for a cup of coffee and maybe a small sandwich to stretch until tomorrow. Mr. Patel, the cafe owner, was behind the counter, wiping it down with the same slow precision I remembered from years ago when Calvin was still in school and I'd occasionally stopped in here. He greeted me like no time had passed. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for a paper cup. As he poured, my eyes drifted to the bright display near the register. A row of lottery tickets, the bold headline promising a record-breaking jackpot over $3 million. It was the same jackpot I'd seen mentioned on the attic TV. "Feeling lucky today?" Mr. Patel asked. Following my gaze, I almost laughed. Luck hadn't been in my vocabulary for years. But something in his tone, light, almost teasing, made me slide a $10 bill across the counter. "Coffee and one ticket," I said. He fed the slip through the machine, tore it neatly, and handed it over with my change. The paper felt weightless in my hand. Just another small gamble in a life that had been nothing but risks I hadn't chosen. By nightfall, I was in a roadside motel, the kind with humming neon signs and a TV bolted to the dresser. I sipped lukewarm coffee from the cafe, my bags propped against the door, and half listened to the evening news. The numbers appeared on the screen in quick succession. 7, 14, 23, 31, 42, Powerball 18. I froze. Slowly, I reached for my wallet, slid out the ticket, and compared them. Once, twice, a third time, my heart thudding louder with each match. Every number was there. The motel room didn't change the peeling wallpaper, the buzzing light, but I felt the ground shift under me. My hands trembled, not from disbelief, but from the sudden understanding of what this meant. I folded the ticket carefully, slid it back into my wallet, and set it beside me on the bed. For the first time in years, the next move would be mine alone. The next morning, I called the state lottery office from a payphone outside the motel. My voice sounded steadier than I felt as I gave my name and the ticket numbers. The woman on the other end congratulated me and scheduled an appointment for the following day. She reminded me to sign the back of the ticket immediately, as if it might sprout legs and run away before I arrived. I spent that day in a haze of planning. This was not a windfall I could flaunt. It was leverage I needed to protect. I called an attorney from the next town over, someone who had never crossed paths with Calvin or Walter, and explained I wanted the claim filed through a trust. He didn't ask questions beyond the legal necessities. At the lottery office, they confirmed the win and walked me through my options. I chose the lump sum without hesitation, after taxes. It came to just over $1,900,000. They transferred the funds into the trust account within a week, and I immediately began separating it into smaller, untraceable parts, multiple bank accounts, a shell company under a generic name, and a healthy stash of cash in a safe deposit box. The entire process was conducted without fanfare. No oversized checks. No smiling photos in the paper. My name wouldn't hit the public record for at least 2 months. And by then, I'd be unrecognizable in circumstance, if not in face. That first night after the transfer, I sat in the quiet of my motel room, staring at the printed confirmation of the balance. The numbers were almost abstract, more than I'd ever imagined holding in my own right. For years, I had asked for so little, just enough to keep a roof overhead and the bills paid. Now, I could buy roofs, whole buildings, and never need permission to step inside. The fear that had been a constant undercurrent in my life began to dissolve, replaced by a calm, deliberate certainty. I could decide where I lived, how I lived, and with whom I shared any part of it. And the first step would be finding a place that belonged entirely to me. The property sat at the end of a gravel road, flanked by rolling fields and a thin line of pines. From the moment I stepped out of the realtor's truck, I could feel the quiet pressing in, not in a suffocating way, but like a shield. The main house was modest white siding, a wide porch, nothing to draw unnecessary attention. What caught my eye was the barn. It had been renovated into a solid, functional structure with stalls on the ground floor and a small loft apartment above. The realtor mentioned it had once housed seasonal workers during harvest. We climbed the narrow stairs to a door with peeling paint, and when she opened it, I stepped inside and smiled without meaning to. The space was clean but plain low ceilings, a dormer window, and just enough room for a narrow bed, a small table, and a kitchenette tucked into the corner. The bathroom was no larger than a closet, with a shower stall and a cracked mirror over the sink. It was humble, almost stark, but it carried the same feel as Calvin's attic. I knew instantly this loft would serve a purpose beyond storage. I made the offer that afternoon, full asking price, cash, closing in 3 weeks, no contingencies. The realtor's relief was palpable. By the time I turned the key in the front door, I'd already made my next decision. This wouldn't just be my sanctuary. It would be a place that worked for something bigger than me. I contacted local shelters and rescue networks, letting them know I planned to take in animals in need of space and care. That's how I met Mara Quinn, a 24-year-old veterinary student looking for leave-in work. She had quick hands, a ready smile, and eyes that didn't flinch from hard stories. When I offered her the larger upstairs bedroom in the main house in exchange for part-time help, she agreed on the spot. Within a week, We had our first residents 2 dogs from the county shelter, a horse rescued from a neglect case, and a pair of goats abandoned when their owners moved. Every morning, the sound of hooves and paws replaced the restless silence I'd known in Calvin's attic, and every time I climbed those narrow barn stairs, I was reminded exactly what it felt like to be given just enough to survive. I already knew who might one day be living there. By late summer, the fields around my property had turned a deep gold, and the barn was full of steady sounds, hooves shifting in straw, the low bleat of goats, Mara's voice humming while she worked. I hadn't spoken to Calvin in months, but news still traveled. A mutual acquaintance mentioned his company had been downsizing. 2 weeks later, I heard he was among those let go. Around the same time, I learned Tessa's mother had sold her riverfront apartment and moved to be closer to her own sister out of state. The timing couldn't have been worse for them. Tessa was 7 months along. Their lease was expiring, and Calvin's severance wouldn't stretch far. It was a warm, windy afternoon when I saw the dust trail on the road leading to my gate. A silver SUV slowed, then stopped. Calvin stepped out first, wearing the same polite smile he'd used on neighbors and clients. Tessa followed, moving slower, her belly prominent under a loose dress. "Mom," Calvin said, resting his hands on the gate. "We need to talk." I leaned on the top rail, letting the moment stretch. They looked tired, Calvin's hair a little too long, Tessa's face drawn and pale. "We've had some setbacks," he continued. "I'm between jobs, and with the baby coming," he glanced toward the main house. "We were hoping we could stay here for a while, just until we get back on our feet." I nodded slowly, as though considering it for the first time. Tessa's eyes followed mine toward the porch, the open windows, the shaded chairs. I could almost hear her picturing herself there, away from the heat and dust. Finally, I stepped back and unlatched the gate. "You can stay," I said, "but not in the house." They exchanged a quick, confused glance. "In the loft," I added, gesturing toward the barn. "It's available." I turned toward the path before they could answer, letting the crunch of my boots on gravel carry me back to the work waiting in the stables. I led them across the yard, the wind carrying the smell of hay and warm earth. The barn doors stood open, the interior dim except for thin bands of sunlight filtering through the slats. Mara glanced up from brushing one of the horses, curiosity flickering across her face, but she said nothing. The stairs to the loft were narrow, the wood worn smooth from years of use. I climbed first, hearing their footsteps behind me. Slower now. At the top, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The space was clean but spare whitewashed walls, a small bed with a plain quilt, a battered dresser, and a table in the corner under the dormer window. The kitchenette was just big enough for a mini fridge, a 2-burner stove, and a sink. The bathroom door hung slightly askew, the kind of imperfection that didn't affect function, but stripped away any illusion of luxury. Calvin stepped inside, his gaze moving quickly over the room. Tessa lingered at the threshold, her arms folded, eyes narrowing at the low ceiling and scuffed floor. "This is what we have," I said evenly. "It comes with a few rules. Up at 5 for morning chores. No loud music or TV after 9, the animals spook easily. Everyone contributes to the work. No exceptions." Mom, Calvin began. I raised a hand. "This isn't negotiable. If you're here, you're part of the farm. That means feeding, mucking stalls, repairs, whatever needs doing. Groceries and utilities are covered. But you handle your own meals. The loft is yours for as long as you follow the rules." Tessa's mouth tightened, her gaze fixed on the bed as if it had personally offended her. Calvin nodded once, the movement stiff. "Understood." "Good," I said, stepping back toward the stairs. "I'll have Mara bring up fresh linens. You can settle in tonight." As I descended, the sound of their voices low, tense, followed me, blending into the creak of the wood. In the main aisle of the barn, Mara looked at me with a question in her eyes. I didn't answer. There would be time for that later. Winter settled over the farm in slow layers, frost on the fence rails at dawn, the muted crunch of boots on frozen ground. Calvin rose before the alarm most mornings, already pulling on work gloves by the time I came out to the barn. At first, he moved like a man doing penance, his shoulders stiff, his eyes avoiding mine. But over time, the motions became second nature, checking water troughs, repairing latches, leading the horses out to pasture with steady hands. Tessa kept to the loft in the beginning, emerging mainly for appointments in town or quick trips to the feed store. But one day she appeared at the kitchen table with a stack of receipts and a notepad. "Your donation records aren't in order," she said matter-of-factly. I let her sort through them, curious to see if she'd follow through. By the end of the week, she'd organized 6 months of expenses into color-coded folders and set up a digital system even Mara admitted was better than ours. The complaints that had marked their early days here about the early mornings, the draft in the loft, the lack of space faded. They still kept to themselves, but I noticed small changes, Calvin lingering to rub a horse's neck after feeding, Tessa carrying a mug of tea across the yard without checking her phone every few steps. One evening, as we closed up the barn, Mara leaned on her pitchfork and nodded toward the loft window, where the light glowed warm against the dark. "They're starting to belong here," she said. I followed her gaze. Inside, I could just make out Tessa's silhouette at the table, her head bent over paperwork, and Calvin beside her, holding the baby while she wrote. The sight caught me off guard, not for its novelty, but for how natural it looked. Still, I kept my hands in my pockets and my thoughts to myself. Belonging was one thing, earning it was another, and the difference between the two was something I intended to measure carefully. Tessa came to the main house one afternoon with a manila folder tucked under her arm. She sat at the kitchen table, her voice steady as she slid the papers toward me. It was a formal proposal she and Calvin wanted to stay on as full-time farm managers. Salaries modest, responsibilities clear. The loft would remain mine, deeded permanently in my name. "We deserved what we went through," she said. "It changed us, made us better." I leafed through the pages without comment. "There's something else," she added quietly. "Calvin talks to the baby about you every night, tells him you're strong, that you've sacrificed more than anyone he knows. He wants him to grow up respecting that." I looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "You can stay, but there's one condition, respect. Lose it, and there are no second chances." Her eyes held mine. "Understood." Later, I stood by the barn, watching Calvin load hay into the back of the truck. His movements were sure, deliberate, not the restless, careless gestures I remembered. Through the loft window, I could see him pause to adjust his gloves, steady hands at work. No longer the man who once sent me upstairs.